Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today it is Short Story Tuesday, so I wanted to revisit some horror from a classic science fiction horror type author. It's a short story about an unusual boarding house tenant. I am referring to Cool Air by H.P. Lovecraft, which was published in 1928. For those who don't know, H.P. Lovecraft was a science fiction slash horror writer, often known for writing pulp fiction, pulpy kind of fiction, that showed up in those science fiction and horror magazines of the 1920s and 30s and 40s and even 50s. And he's regarded as like a pretty big name for his time, although a lot of people have looked back and said that his writing isn't that great, that he was mainly just writing pulp and there wasn't much substance to what he was writing. But others believe that he was like his writing is good, and that his attention away from humans onto more complex cosmic sort of horrors was a good step in the right direction for horror and science fiction at the time, as he's known for writing about sort of cosmic, spacey type of horror, and he created the Cthulhu mythos, which a lot of people have talked about. And he also sort of is one of the first writers to talk about the Necronomicon, which a whole bunch of fantasy writers have picked up on since then. Unfortunately, Lovecraft was also seen as racist and was a pretty conservative author, although that changed as the years went on for him. As some people have noted, he became more socialist in nature. But it is important to know the sort of racist underpinnings of some of his writing, especially as it pertains to Asian cultures. I've noted that in particular. So it's important to call that out when we see it. But without further ado, let's talk about Cool Air. I will do a summary, a little bit of an analysis, and we will move on from there. So Cool Air focuses on a narrator in an unnamed city. They are searching for a place to stay in the city, going from boarding house to boarding house. And they finally managed to find a 4-story mansion. It's a bit unsettling for them, but they decide to stay there. And one day, while they're into their work and their mind is elsewhere, they begin to realize that they're smelling ammonia a lot, and they notice that it's dripping from the ceiling, which the narrator gets the landlady, and she exclaims that that's from Dr. Munoz upstairs. She goes upstairs and fixes the problem so that it's no longer leaking, but it's there that he learns that he likes to keep the room that he's in very cold, and there's a lot of ammonia and other chemicals that he's working with for some undisclosed purpose. But the narrator eventually falls ill, and they go to Dr. Munoz, who helps them feel better with their heart or their seizures. It's a bit unclear on what exactly that problem was, but they strike up a little bit of a friendship with Dr. Munoz, noting that he's a little bit paranoid, anxious, and he's desperate to keep his room cool, and he's working on some sort of experiment that he doesn't really elaborate on, especially the narrator noting that just being around Dr. Munoz, while they do like him, like the narrator is a bit unsettled, repugnance fills the air for a reason that isn't quite clear to them initially. But they maintain a friendship, but then Dr. Munoz begins getting more paranoid, more anxious, not letting anyone see him. He falls deeply ill or something like that. He begins to sort of fall apart mentally and physically, and doesn't allow any visitors. And he starts requesting tons of ice be delivered to him. And then finally the narrator just decides, I'm gonna, pay someone off the street to go and do that. But when that person arrives at Dr. Munoz's his specific apartment, the delivery man is scared and runs away without dropping off the ice. And so the other tenants hear about this and decide to go pay a visit to the specific apartment. And the other tenants are scared off as the story comes to a close. But the narrator sees Dr. Munoz just dead on the floor and encounters a note that says that basically Dr. Munoz has been dead this entire time, and they've been keeping themselves artificially alive with this cool air and with the various chemicals. In terms of analysis, there is quite a bit to talk about with this short story. The first thing is that Lovecraft is playing with horror here. Like, this is a horror short story, and it builds upon the kind of horror that Lovecraft has been writing for quite some time, specifically the unnameable, sort of like otherworldly type of horror that we can't quite put a name to or describe, but it's there, and it terrifies us. Like all this ammonia and ice that Dr. Munoz is using in the story, it feels wrong. Like, the narrators can't describe why it feels wrong, but they just know that no regular person would be using these types of chemicals. And the fact that Dr. Munoz is, it just makes it harder to be around him, because what's his purpose? He's not really being clear about what he needs all of this for. Everyone feels a great sense of dread. There's a part in like the story where like the landlady is talking about Dr. Munoz, and the narrator can tell she's not very happy every time she has to mention him. And even when the narrator is hanging out with Dr. Munoz, like, he feels a sense of repugnance. Like, he feels deeply uncomfortable by what he sees when he looks at Dr. Munoz, especially as time progresses and he begins to fall more ill. Like, there's something weird happening here that you can't quite put a name to. Essentially, the subconscious senses that something is wrong, that something is otherworldly or less than human going on here. And indeed, we later find out that he's dead. So, like, the subconscious realizes this is not a human being. There's something present before you that is tricking you or something like that. And you can't put words to it because it's in your subconscious. But once you realize what's happening, you're like, oh, it suddenly all makes sense. I know why I was afraid. And that's something that Lovecraft works with pretty frequently. That sort of unnameable horror, or like what I'm seeing fills me with dread or drives me insane. And I don't like it. Like, it's similar to At the Mountains of Madness, or In the Mountains of Madness, where the narrator can't really describe why these remnants from a previous civilization that might not have been human, like, disturb them, but it becomes much more clear when the narrator realizes they have to leave and get out of here, because they might be, the creatures might still be around or something like that. So I do like this type of horror that Lovecraft is building upon. It seems different than all the other horror that I've been reading thus far with Stephen Graham Jones and especially Edgar Allan Poe. Lovecraft also makes use of foreshadowing and cool air, specifically with the chemicals that are being used. Maybe people at the time would have known this, but a lot of the chemicals, ammonia and whatnot, all those that are being used are used in funerals, that embalmers or something like that use to make sure that like the body stays fresh or stops smelling or something like that, so you can prepare it for an open casket or something like that, and bury the body, and everything is good. And so if you knew that, you might get a sense that this has something to do with death. And so you can see Lovecraft like setting the pieces for this eventual reveal. And then there's also references to Egypt in this in the short story. And given that I kind of guessed it from there, what was kind of maybe happening. I thought like the narrator was gonna like embalm or mummify himself, but it turns out he was already dead. But like the references to Egypt with like a culture that worships the dead sometimes, or like in ancient Egypt, how they mummified or used those chemicals to to take care of the dead. You see that kind of happening here with the character trying to preserve himself for as long as possible. And again, like it's really good foreshadowing. I don't think a lot of people at the time that this was written might have known too much about Egypt, especially as those things were starting to be unearthed and more was being learned about that culture. But I do think it's pretty good writing on the part of Lovecraft here. The one issue that I can say with Lovecraft that I found here, but as well as many of his other stories, is Lovecraft is a little wordy. He loves to write. I think he loves to hear himself talk. And that sometimes means that his stories drone on and on and on and on. And sometimes it goes on long past its intended point, or he's just describing things that don't need to be talked about, or he's even using words that he might not need to use. Like he could substitute a much smaller word in its place, and that happens here, as well as a couple of other Lovecraft stories that I found. It doesn't really sink the story, but it does make it a real chore to read at times. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Cool Air by H.P. Lovecraft. A pretty solid short story, one that I think is worth reading. Even though I told you the ending, it's still fun to see how he gets there, and the horror once everybody realizes what happens. It's pretty hard to beat. I think there's a reason why we still talk about Lovecraft to this day. Even though he might not be one of the best horror writers, he's still a competent one. So I'll put a link to it in the description so that you can find it and check it out. Let me know what you think in the comments. Let's have a discussion about this. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this author and this specific short story if they want to read this one or other ones. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and undead travels. Farewell.